Hello everyone, it's Silver. This is Kunitsu-Gami, Path of the Goddess. I wanted to look at this because I didn't know what it was, because I didn't know what to expect. It looked interesting. It was a Capcom game, and it sort of looked a little bit hack and slashy, a little bit maybe defense-y, but I was a little bit confused as to what specifically it was. So I gave it a shot, and it turns out it's actually really involved and a lot of fun, and there's a lot to it. This is actually, well, it's an action strategy game, meaning it's basically a hybrid between a hack and slash and a tower defense. Only your towers are villagers, the actual people that you can move around, and you're not defending a stationary core, but rather a living person, a shrine maiden. But first, the audio-visual presentation of the game is definitely worthy of mention because look at it. It's really pretty. It uses a lot of Kagura Dance themes, of course, because that's what your maiden is doing, and also that's involved in how everything works, how the villagers move, and how your strong sword attacks work are also called dance attacks. So the idea of a Kagura Dance is very much implicit in every aspect of how this game works, but it's also that sort of holy festival theming is important to how it looks. The game uses somewhat of an interesting camera angle because it kind of looks 2D if you were to look at just screenshots for the game. It sort of looks like you have 2D movement in a 3D world, but no, it is fully 3D and you can move the camera in 3 dimensions, 360 degrees. It just doesn't necessarily give that impression upon first looking at it, probably because of this really heavily zoomed out camera angle that's more akin to something like a side-scroller. But visually, it's got this really neat appearance to it where everything that is related to the Kagura Dance and the sort of holy procession, the Path of the Goddess that you are a part of, you are a guardian that was summoned by the Shrine Maiden to defend her. Everything in relation to that is sort of ultra bright and pretty. And then everything that is related to the enemies, which we call the Seethe, are this defilement, this corruption, that is also really colorful, but in sort of a negative way. The colors of your squad and all of your friends and everything are sort of bright, golden, and pretty, and oftentimes you have these sort of geometric mandala-like patterns that show up whenever something especially magical happens, like, say, purifying a big gate and things, whereas the colors in regards to the enemies are more chaotic, inky, sort of mixed in an uneven way, things like that that make them look immediately strange and kind of alien, and a lot of the enemies you'll be facing are different kinds of yokai. And the game uses a pretty interesting version of a lot of them that are visually unusual in comparison to how I often see them depicted, and it also uses a lot of them I've never heard of before, that also have some really neat and sort of sinister appearances to them. And the music is exactly like what you would expect for a game like this. It is that sort of traditional holy festival slash Kagura Dance style of doing things, so it sounds great, it's really high energy, and it's also mixed in with some more sinister ambient stuff depending on the time of day. During the day, as the nighttime approaches, it sort of builds up this more kind of sinister, evil bell and creepy ambient sort of combination that builds up and eventually sort of explodes at nighttime into the more combat-oriented music. And then once you purify something, then you get this like happy, holy festival style of thing going on. It's a really cool soundtrack actually, and it's nice how varied it is depending on what specifically you're doing, how reactive it is to what you're actually accomplishing at that particular time. So overall, the way the game's audio-visual presentation is fantastic. It looks and sounds great. And I guess the closest thing you're probably going to be looking at is something like Okami, in terms of how that game also uses a lot of sort of watercolor swishes and stuff, which your strong dance sword slashes also use. Although the whole game doesn't look like that in this case. But the game also does have some Okami-themed talismans and things you can get. You can get a couple of aesthetic things that are themed around Okami, which makes sense since it was also a Capcom-published game. So you can do things like equipping a talisman that makes flowers sprout up wherever you run and things like that. You'll also notice that all of the menus and interface of the game is very much like a kind of diegetic interface somewhat. Like, you don't really get a lot of standard health gauges and stuff. You know, your and all of your villagers' health gauges, as well as the enemies' health gauges, except for bosses, are these sort of vertical banners. And the villagers actually get more ornate banners as you upgrade them, which is pretty cool. And the enemy ones also get sort of more advanced when you get to stronger looking enemies and stuff. So yeah, there's a lot when it comes to how this game presents itself, and I'm a big fan of all of its presentation in general, and all of its menus and the way that it does things. things is very like representative, very like sort of pictographical almost. So, you know, almost everything, rather than being an interface element, is just sort of like a version of that thing in real life. So you can equip different hand guards for your sword, for instance, that have special powers, and rather than being like a gauge that represents them, it's just the guard itself, like a picture of the guard on a knotted rope that lets you know which one you have equipped and how cooled down it is. So yeah, that's just sort of how it does everything. The overall gameplay loop here is pretty involved. So when you first start a stage, you will have a long path of corruption that goes to a Torii gate, one of those big red gates. And that gate, come nighttime, will spawn a bunch of enemies that will go along the path and try and attack Yoshiro, your shrine maiden slash priestess. And the whole idea, of course, is you gotta explore around during the daytime and free a bunch of the corruption, free the villagers and dispel the corruption and stuff as much as you can, so that you have as much to work with as possible when nighttime falls. Because when nighttime happens, you can't uncorrupt anything. You can't purify anything during the nighttime. You just gotta sort of hunker down and try to survive. The maps are a pretty good size and are very good at hiding stuff, so you do really need to explore around them and use your camera a lot to find things, because the main two things you'll be looking for are villagers, which are cocooned, and freeing them is what allows you to actually use them as defense agents and stuff afterwards, so you want as many of them as possible. Every level has a specific number that you can find, and you want to find them all as soon as you can. And then you'll also be looking for these just big nexuses of corruption, just a whole bunch of corruption in one place, which you can purify, and this gives you a bunch of crystals. You want these because you need the crystals to do everything. They are your main currency for pretty much everything you need to do. So this is the primary way of getting them. Enemies also drop a bunch of them, so defeating enemies at nighttime is another good way to get them, but in terms of the thing you can do at daytime to actually get a hold of them before nighttime, purifying these areas is the only major way to do it. Also, every area will have an offering box, like a shrine offering box, and if you manage to find and purify all of the corrupt areas in each zone, then the offering box will open up and you can go and get a reward. And these are unique rewards that you can only get by doing this. They are often things like new hand guards for your sword, which give you new, especially powerful abilities, or some new talismans that you can equip for extra passive effects. Now, by default, your priestess will not move. She will stand at the entrance to an area, and you will see the long path stretching out in front of her to the gate. You have to actually carve a path by plunging your sword into the ground and running in a straight line in order to mark it for purification. After you carve a path, any amount of path, she will start to slowly move forward, doing a Kagura Dance and purifying everything, and eventually you want to carve a path all the way to the gate at the end of the area so that she can actually get to that, and then you can all purify it together. Carving this path takes a large number of crystals per second, so you need a lot of them saved up in order to get the whole path. But like I said, she will walk on an incomplete path until it ends, so you can just purify it in stages if you need to. This particular mechanic is actually really important because it's one of the key differences between this and a more traditional tower defense, where the thing you're defending is usually stationary. But in this case, you could be defending that person at any point along this path. There are no like set notches that she always defaults to or anything. She'll just slowly purify it, and whenever night falls, she'll stop in place. And you have to defend her right where she is. So the concept of like mazing or setting up a bunch of walls and stuff doesn't quite work like that in this game, because you're never exactly sure where she's going to be until she starts purifying. Luckily, there is a sort of ghost preview that shows you where she's going to stop come nightfall. And if you want, you can actually walk up to her and tell her to stop moving temporarily or to start moving again. This is because it's possible for her to stop somewhere like right in front of one of the gates, like right where the enemies are about to spawn, but not close enough for you to purify it yet. So she'll be right there and enemies will be spawning right in her face, and that would obviously be very, very bad for you. So if you notice that that's about to happen this night, you might want to tell her to stop in a more defensible area that you'll have an easier time actually, sitting around in and trying to defend her from all of the demons. You have a useful command interface that allows you to command all of your villagers individually and put them wherever you want. You just point and click, almost like a sort of RTS interface, really. And when you do that, they will walk as best as they can to wherever you tell them to go. And before you do this, you'll want to assign them a role, and this is your other main use for crystals. You'll start out with only the one simple woodcutter role, which is just a dude with an axe, which is actually surprisingly useful even to the end game. But as you defeat bosses, you'll get new masks that represent unlocking new roles that you can give villagers. Different rolls cost different amounts of crystals, so you got to be careful about how many you have banked up and stuff, and if you still need to carve the path at all and all that sort of thing to factor into your strategy, because some of the rolls like woodcutters or archers are really inexpensive at like 50 crystals each, but then you've got people like mages, which are like onmyoji style mages, and sumo wrestlers that cost 300 each, so you can't have very many of those. Also, there are two different types of villagers that you'll come across. They have this little inked animal that represents what type they are. There's one that's represented by a tortoise and one by something else. I can't quite tell what it is, to be honest. But different roles can sometimes require different types of villagers. You know, like your usual woodcutter or archer, they can be anyone. Any type of villager can become one of those. But if you want, say, a sumo wrestler, you've got to have a tortoise villager. This is especially important because the other kind of villager can become a shaman, which is a healer, an AoE healer, the only source of healing like that in the game, basically. So it's really nice to have some of them, but those types of villagers are often a little bit more rare than the tortoise type, so you have a different limiting factor in terms of how many of a certain kind of villager you can have, especially with like healers and stuff, that isn't just related to the amount of crystals you have, it's also related to the people that you've rescued. Come nightfall, you can just sort of rejigger everyone wherever you need them to be, and you can get pretty specific. You can even get some other tools later on via upgrades for things like the ability to call everyone to you all at one time, or to even order your priestess to stop and start moving remotely without having to actually walk up to her. These are all upgrades you can get later. And also, you get an all defend and an all attack feature in boss fights only. If a villager dies, you don't actually lose them permanently. They instead get re-cocooned up into a corruption cocoon. And since you can't purify things during the night, you have to finish the rest of the night without them. But as soon as it's daytime, you can re-purify them. And they will sort of respawn at like half-ish health. There are rations that you can get that are a full heal. You can use them on yourself or individually on any of your villagers, and it will heal whoever you use it on back to full. But you can only carry a small number of them, and getting more of them can be a little bit tricky. Oftentimes you have to purify wild animals in order to get rations. But another thing you've got to factor into your strategy is the fact that the area itself can have a whole bunch of other stuff for you to interact with. Like, for instance, during the day, there might be a pile of rocks or a broken bridge that has some useful stuff on the other side of it that you can't get to until you command some of your villagers to go over there and fix it for you, which takes a specific number of villagers rescued and a specific amount of time out of the day in order to do it. So you'll want to be exploring the maps very early on and assigning people as often as possible to get these things done quickly. That way you can have as much of the resources available on the map as possible during nightfall. There are also contraptions, as they're called, which are various features on the maps that will help you out. There are things like these stone amplifier pad thingies that if your priestess stops on them during the night, they generate a sort of damaging field that helps to protect her, although it doesn't last forever. It's still really useful. There are also these pylon things that increase the attack of any of your villagers within a certain area of effect of them. There are towers that you can put ranged units on that will drastically increase their range so that they can reach much farther if they're on one of those. And there are several other kinds, like these barriers, that will stop enemies for a while until they do enough damage to them. And you'll find that you have a carpenter with you at any given time that can help you out. He will repair any of these contraptions to help you get them working, because when you first come to a map, pretty much all of them will be broken, except for the occasional cannon or drum. So you've got to go around and, again, take time. Time is very important in this game, to have him fix things. He can only fix a certain number of things per day, since they all take a certain amount of time, but other than that, they don't take any resources or anything. He's got it all covered, so just order him around, and he can only fix one thing at a time, so you want to prioritize the stuff that seems most relevant to the path you're currently taking. Sometimes while you're purifying the path itself, you'll come across a fork, and you can either choose to go left or right. They each have, different hazards and different useful contraptions and things like that, so you just gotta figure out which one you think looks more defensible to you and choose, and then that will allow you to purify the rest of it to the gate. Another thing to keep an eye on is that there will be smaller torii gates off to the side of the level, other than the main one that you're walking towards, and these can also spawn enemies, and they'll glow purple on your minimap to show you which ones are going to be active that night, so you can sort of try to plan ahead, because this means that you'll often have several pathways of enemies converging at once to try and get to you. Once you finally reach the torii gate with the priestess, you can do a quick little mini-game to purify it. This involves keeping a sort of egg-shaped reticle in the center of the screen. It'll constantly be trying to fling itself around to the edges, and you gotta try and keep it centered as much as possible. And once this minigame is over, the gate will be purified. And also, the longer you were able to keep it in the middle of the screen, the more health is restored to Yoshiro, the priestess herself. This is the only way to heal her. Generally, a level is 2 halves, so once you make it to the first Torii gate, you will do the same thing again in a second half of the level with a whole bunch of new stuff to find, new contraptions to repair, new villagers to save, and things like that. This means that the first half of the level is often more difficult because you don't have all the villagers yet. You very rarely will get all of them in the first half. Usually it'll save some in the later half for you to find. So if a level has, say, 8 villagers, then you may only be working with like 5 of those for the first couple of nights until you can get to the second half of the stage and free the other 3. So there's a lot of moving parts to the strategy portion of this game. It's surprisingly involved, and I had a lot of fun doing it. And not only are these levels often quite large, and they have just a lot of stuff to find and work into your strategy each night, and they're all quite different from each other, but also there are several levels where it will mix it up a little bit and change how things work. For instance, you have cave levels, which are very dark, and you have to actually light them up, and you have to take a villager away from their post for a minute to tell them to light up a lantern, and there are only a set number of lanterns throughout the area to light up, and your villagers will not attack enemies in the darkness. They can't see them, so you've got to light the areas up if you want to be able to defend efficiently. And there's, of course, also a type of enemy that will consume the flames and force you to relight them as well that you've got to keep an eye out for. There are also boat levels where you have to go along a sort of flotilla of boats all connected with wooden bridges, and a whole bunch of nasty demons will approach and try to sink your ships, and if anyone is on a ship when it sinks, then they all immediately die, so you gotta be careful about that. But these are levels that are less about like strategy and pathing and stuff, and more about, do you have a good composition of villagers? Did you find them all before you set sail? That kind of thing. There are also some levels that put you into spirit form. These are particularly difficult, so whenever you die in this game, you become a spirit for a while, and then eventually your health will sort of regen and you'll respawn. But during that time in spirit form, you can only command your villagers. That's it, you can't fight or anything yourself. And it's usually relatively brief, although it does seem to last longer in boss battles. But in some stages, your priestess will get possessed and you'll lose your physical form entirely, so for that entire stage, you will be only in spirit form. So you'll need to command your villagers and things exclusively. You won't be able to do any of the fighting yourself, and then you'll have to gather a whole bunch of crystals to offer to the priestess in order to purify her and move on. You yourself are a very capable fighter. Your attacks are quite high damage, and you have, as mentioned before, those dance attacks that are really powerful. You'll also eventually be able to unlock more dance styles that will change how your animations work for your dance attacks, and also give you chargeable versions of them, which are like extended combos that are very strong and can stagger enemies. You'll also be able to get a handful of other things like, say, a bow, which does a small amount of damage at range, but can also be used with things like butterfly arrows, which allow you to teleport to where the arrow lands, therefore crossing a lot of distance really quickly, and in fact there are several areas on a lot of maps that you can only get to once you have these. The upgrade system is pretty fun, so there is like a base building idea. Once you've completed a stage, you can go back to that stage as a destroyed shrine and rebuild it, and all of the villagers that you've freed will be available for you to tell to do various tasks and start rebuilding stuff, and they'll complete tasks based on the number of stages you complete while they're doing it. So most rebuilds only take 1 stage, some take 2. And as you're rebuilding, you'll get various resources and things, and eventually once you completely rebuild a level, then you'll get a big reward at the end as well. But one of the main things you'll get from finishing levels, from doing challenges in levels, which are extra difficult ways to beat them, and also during rebuilding stuff, you'll get these bags called musubi, and I think it's supposed to be a bag on purpose, like it's sort of a play on words, because musubi is a food. It's like a sort of seaweed, rice, and fish food, but it also is a Shinto term that means like to tie together, sort of togetherness, closeness. So I think the fact that it's always in a bag and you never see exactly what it is kind of the point. But you use the mysterious Schrodinger's Musume to upgrade yourself and your villagers. Every villager has 6 different upgrades, 4 of which are basic stat improvements, and 2 of which are big milestones that drastically improve what they can do, often giving them new attacks or new capabilities in some way. And also the villagers' masks get more painted and ornate the more you upgrade them, which is a cool touch, as well as their health banners. They also change. And your character, So, also has a whole bunch of different upgrades that you can purchase with this resource as well, from new dance styles to various charge attacks and improved tools, and also extra command styles, like maybe you want the ability to just call everyone to you at once with one button press. Things like that are often really handy in a sort of strategy layer like this. But one of the coolest parts about all of the Musubi upgrades is that they are completely refundable with no pains. You just refund them whenever you want, and you can get the exact amount that you put into it and put them somewhere else. So you're encouraged to swap around your upgrades and stuff frequently, depending on what new village roles you may have got, or what new upgrades you may want for yourself, and things like that. And especially if you're having a lot of trouble with a specific boss fight or something, because the boss fights in this game are very involved. They have a lot of mechanics to them, a lot of attacks to learn, and special phases where they might damage Yoshiro at specific points that you've got to avoid or do something to prevent them from doing, almost like a raid boss kind of in terms of how they work. A lot of circles on the ground to be avoided, and you also want to be doing a lot of defense and attack changing to pull your units around so that you can make them avoid taking a bunch of damage, or maybe it spawns a bunch of ads, so you need to pull all your villagers back, because as soon as you do that, they'll form like a circle around her and defend her as much as possible. They're really fun, honestly, but they can be quite challenging, and some of them have a little bit more of like a puzzle element too, including some platforming and stuff sometimes. So there's a lot here. There's a lot of content to go through, and of course you're encouraged to replay levels to do those extra challenge bits to get more upgrades. There's a lot of upgrades to try, and there's quite a few bosses to defeat and stuff. So overall, I think it's a pretty cool game because it manages to sort of squeeze every drop out of its formula that there is, I think. You know, this is not the kind of game where I expect a sequel, but what's here is a lot of fun because it manages to take the concept of a sort of hack and slash meets tower defense and get every ounce of potential out of it that's possible, with all sorts of different mechanical additions and alterations and stuff along the way to help keep it fresh. So if you're looking for something a little bit unusual, something a little bit different, and want to try something that maybe you've never seen before, I would say it's very well worth getting a hold of Kunitsu-Gami because it does a lot of unique things in a beautiful style that are just really fun to try out, and I had a surprising amount of fun with it, considering I went in with no real expectations because I didn't exactly know what it entailed. So I'll put the link in the description below this video to the Steam store page for the game if you guys wish to check it out yourselves. Thank you very much for watching, and I'll see you next time.